Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, let's look ahead a little bit. The world political situation polarizes, I think, in some ways into elitism versus populism. Elitism, represented by central bankers, finance oligarchs, Wall Street, the City of London, various Eurogorks, Eurocrats, third world oligarchs, and so forth. And then populism, which is this notion that the entire institutions and economy of the world cannot be exclusively dedicated to the aggrandizement of 1% or 1/2 of 1%, but to some broader notion, in particular the maintenance of a middle class. We know under the Roosevelt New Deal, for the first time in world history, we have a situation in the United States where the middle class became, and perhaps still is, although just barely, the numerical majority of the entire society. Certainly, the U.S. government doesn't care about middle class interests. It is exclusively concerned with Obama, under Obama, with Wall Street financier interests. The various zombie bankers dictate the policy. In Europe, this takes the form of the struggle against the European Union, and in particular of the European Central Bank, which is in many ways institutionally worse than the Federal Reserve, in the sense that the head of the Federal Reserve has to be nominated by the President and pass a Senate confirmation hearing. In the European Central Bank, the procedure for becoming the head of it is even much watered down compared to that. Right now it's the French finance oligarch Trichet, who has been doing a terrible job in a terrible institution which should not exist. Therefore, any country thinking of joining the European Union has to think about the following. The European Union is not what it was. Back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the European Economic Community, as it was known then, much more modest, an economic community, customs union with some add-ons, was in many ways a progressive institution. It had a great deal of social democratic, egalitarian, populist influence. It also had a very significant social Catholic influence, Catholic social doctrine represented by somebody like Konrad Adenauer of Germany, Alcide de Gasperi of Italy, and some others, like Jean Monnet of Belgium, also a positive influence on this. So it starts with the European Coal and Steel Union, the Schuman Plan, and so forth. The problem is that you could see it even into the 1980s. There were, in the 70s and 80s, there were clashes between somebody like Margaret Thatcher, who, of course, was a carrier of Austrian financial doctrine and Chicago boy financial doctrine. She would get into fights with the European economic community over something like, should there be a minimum wage in Britain? And she said, no, minimum wage is communism. And the European Commission in Brussels said, no, you've got to have minimum labor standards. So the problem with it is that all belongs to the past. At about 1990, at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, the European single market, and then increasingly with the expansion into Eastern Europe, you've got now a monetarist and neoliberal stress, really Chicago boy and Austrian domination of the European Union, which is associated with people like Barroso, who seems to be basically a recycled Portuguese fascist who is trying to get himself a new term as the head of the European Commission, and this Solana, who went from being the NATO Secretary General to being the European Union foreign policy guy. These are all extremely dubious reactionary political figures, whatever party label they bear. Now, there was, on the 3rd or 4th of September in Berlin, a demonstration of about 1,000 people against the Lisbon Treaty. What is the Lisbon Treaty? Well, the idea of imposing a permanent oligarchical order on Europe was embodied, first of all, in a proposal for a European constitution, which was submitted in 2005 to some referenda. There were votes on this, and in France, it went down to defeat. I was in France just before this occurred. The French voted against it. I was also in the Netherlands before it happened, and Netherlands voted against it. So when the populations of Europe are given a chance on whether they want to vote on this Eurogarchical, Eurocratic regime of top-down domination by finance oligarchs and their political shills, they generally vote against it. So after the shock of the referenda in 2005, the Eurogarchs came back and said, well, we won't make it a constitution. We're going to make it a treaty, and we'll have it signed, therefore it can simply be ratified. We won't need to have these referenda. Ireland, thank goodness, insisted on having a vote on it, and the European Lisbon Treaty, as it's called now, the same idea, but this time as a treaty, was then rejected by the voters of Ireland last summer. So we've just had this 1,000-person demonstration, which at least was a beginning, in Berlin. This is organized by Jürgen Elsässer and his group Volksinitiative, with also Christoph Herstel, expert on Afghanistan, being one of the main speakers, and you can find all that at Volksinitiative. However, now everything turns to Ireland. Ireland on October 2nd, there's a referendum against or for or against the Lisbon Treaty. I urge everybody who listens to this program, anybody who hears this, get yourself out there and mobilize to say no to the Lisbon Treaty in the Irish referendum on October 2nd. Now, this also involves other countries, Iceland, for example. The proposal is now on the table that Iceland should join the European Union. I would warn against any such action. The European Union is not what you think it is. This is not your father's European Union. Even into the 1990s, there were positive features. In particular, the European Regional Fund was able to help Ireland reach probably the highest standard of living in the history of that country in the 1990s, thanks to inputs from the European Regional Fund. But as I say, as time has gone on, those positive features of the European Union have been more and more suppressed and supplanted by an overwhelmingly oligarchical reactionary approach. I would cite again the Gaullist minister, member of the French government under de Gaulle, Marie-France Garot, who in 2005, and you can see some of this in writing on the Internet in various places if you can read French, she said the European Constitution being proposed in 2005 would guarantee the oligarchical running of European institutions, la conduction oligarchique des institutions, the oligarchical conduction, running, management of European institutions would be the result. Now, the other question is, if you get yourself in trouble, countries like Iceland, maybe Latvia now, others, Turkey, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, others, what do you do when you're facing national bankruptcy? Let me just talk about this question of debt moratorium. The debt moratorium simply is a sovereign country says we can't pay and we won't pay, and we'll negotiate possible payment schedule in the future, but we will not be dictated to. In Italy in the 1970s, I talked with a guy called Colonel Taki Mensen. He was the Ghana ambassador to Italy and also to the Vatican. He had been part of a government in Ghana. He was the information minister, so he had to talk about these things. A Ghana government that had declared a debt moratorium several years earlier. Later on in Poland, I talked to a guy called Jerzy Malec, who was the deputy head of the Polish Central Bank, the Bank Narodowy, and he said, look, I'm a superpower of debt, and I can threaten these bankers with debt moratorium and default. It's time now to open a discussion about debt moratorium. Argentina did it in 2001, and we can evaluate the results. Brazil has done it at least once and maybe more. Time to think about debt moratorium, debt freeze, ways to get this huge burden of fictitious paper capital, paper speculation off your backs. So we'll be back next week with that and much more.